can I say welcome to everyone who has joined us for this session, I think the first live session of the 3-day summit. So we're glad that you're here morning, noon, or evening. And can I issue a very special welcome to my two fellow panelists, if you will, and I'll say something about them just in a minute. I'll give a little introduction about them. I'll then tell you how we're running this session, and then we will simply kick it off. But we are hoping that many of you will have questions and will try to feed in some of your views, which I'll try to pick up during our conversation. But first, let me say something about the two colleagues who are with us this morning. First of all, Dr. Zeti. Dr. Zeti is an economist by background and training, and had a really superb career at the central bank in Malaysia, Bank Negara, Malaysia, having a range of roles, rising up, becoming the chief economist there. I always think that is a critical role in a central bank, and then becoming governor, indeed the 7th governor, but the first ever female governor at the central bank in Malaysia. And she held that role for, I believe, 16 years, probably a number of them tumultuous years, but did that with great panache and success. She is known, and this reputation has stayed with her, for having played a major role in successfully helping Malaysia navigate in 1997-98, I believe, the Asian financial crisis, a time of huge turmoil there. And she continues to be influential as she has been throughout her career. She now is co-chair of the Asia School of Business, and was saying earlier that she has just been dealing with a number of students, if you will, of a course on central banking. So she's sharing her wealth and her knowledge. Dr. Zeti, we're delighted that you're here. And then I turned to Katie Murray. So Katie, educated here in Scotland, then I believe off to London. You worked with KPMG for a spell, and then, as I understand it, fell into banking. I believe you say it happened, as it were, which is good. That happened with me as well. Working for Old Mutual for a number of years, and then you found yourself in Johannesburg, I believe, in a very senior role with Old Mutual's emerging markets. And this was in the, 2011 to 15, at a time when, again, a country that was in the wake of and recovering from the great financial crisis, the GFC. So you'll have seen a lot of change and turmoil there. You've come back to this country and took a role at NatWest a few years back, and very quickly moved up and into the role of Group Chief Financial Officer at NatWest, one of our major banks, and that means you're a board director there as well. So two remarkably successful individuals. So these are our panelists. What we intend to do with this session is I shall turn to each colleague to give us a few opening comments or remarks about some things that are very much on their minds under our broad topic for today, which is around global trends in sustainability. What things are happening, but are happening around the world and around us, what needs to happen. And from there, we will have a bit of a conversation. This is possibly a fireside chat as much as it is a formal panel, but we'll see how it goes. As I say, we'd love to hear from some of you who are watching us. So I will just perhaps kick this off simply to share a few of the imponderables, things that I think about in this sphere a great deal. I don't have the answers, but I do think about them a lot. And I think we'll hear debate and discussion that begins to touch on them. One of them is around convergence. And what I mean by that is that we have national interest in lots of things. We operate as countries, and yet there are matters that simply fly all around the world. They just go, they go around us. And if we look at whether it's regulation or response to a pandemic or whatever it is, different countries, different nations, different parts of the world are operating at different speeds. How do we find some convergence so that we can move things forward without creating greater separations amongst populations, amongst countries? So this notion of convergence is really important to me. Related to that is, how do we avoid passing the buck? And I asked that question very much with climate change and response to national expectations. If there is an agreement in individual countries to meet certain standards, for instance, about landfill and the reduction of landfill, is it good enough for a country to meet its standard by shipping its landfill somewhere else? I realize that may be controversial, but we have to think globally, even as we meet our national standards, and think about consequences. I think a lot about time and decision making, making decisions not just for the short term, the near term, but also for the long term. And how do we learn how to evaluate trade-offs as we make important decisions? And I think about culture, organizational culture, culture in our organizations, the new types of working and workplaces that may come out of the COVID experience in organizations around the world. How do we ensure that we know and we help shape and we understand the culture of our organizations, which is not about the plaque on the wall and the nice statements about values. It's about every single person who works in our organization, what judgments they make, how they make decisions, how they interact. So these are some of the things that that I think about. They made me recall a book I read some years ago by an Oxford professor called Ian Golden. It was called Divided Nations. And he was looking at whether the great institutions of the 20th century, which addressed some global matters, were absolutely fit for the 21st century. And he had sections, and this has always remained with me, on areas that are completely beyond us to corral, to put a fence around within our own world, our own country. So he talked about technology, about digital matters. This is just beyond us. These are global things, and we can't rein that in. He talked about pandemics and how viruses spread, quite prescient. He talked about finance, and this was before the great financial crisis, but almost anticipated what could happen as a domino effect. And he talked about climate matters. So I am just really thoughtful. These are not new issues for us, but my goodness, they're on our plates right now. They are keeping us focused ever more, and they're very, very important, and they change constantly. So my thoughts, that's me for the moment. Could I now turn to my two colleagues to share some of their concerns, what they would like to add to the debate to get us going? Dr. Zeti, I'll turn to you first.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this Ethical Finance Summit 2021. And I'm delighted to be here. And I just wanted to start off by talking about how we are frequently confronted with having to manage crises. And very often, this is a global crisis. We have seen financial crises, economic crises, and now it's a health crisis. It's a global pandemic that has major economic consequences. And I will take that up a bit later. But what I wanted to say about managing crises and leadership roles that are important is that in most crises, it's a dynamic phenomenon. And therefore, we can see that it evolves from stage to stage or phase to phase. And the key importance of this is to recognize where the crisis is going so that we can be anticipatory and have policies that deal with the next phase of the crises. And when we had the Asian crisis, although it happened about 22 years ago, it's very relevant as to how we tried to be anticipatory and therefore minimize the impact of the crisis. In essence, that when we saw our currencies collapsing and our financial markets collapsing, we knew that the next stage of the crisis was going to be where the financial institutions will be damaged. And as they are damaged, they will cease lending. And this will in turn have the next phase where the economy will come to a standstill. And therefore, the first thing that we did was to put in place two things. And the first was resolution, institutional arrangements for resolution of the financial sector, repair and resolution. And the second thing was not only just to look at the lenders, but also the borrowers, that is debt restructuring for the large corporates, for the small and medium scale enterprises, for the households. And as a result of doing this, we didn't avoid having a crisis, but we minimized its impact. And as a result, we prevented the extent of the crisis significantly. And within 6 months of doing this, we had a V-shaped recovery. So we defied all the odds against us. The whole international community, the IMF and all the other international organizations, the rating agencies and so on, said that there would be a lost decade. And we defied that. We had a 6% growth within 1 year of this crisis. And the most important thing about a crisis is costs, is fiscal costs. And for us, it was the lowest ever in history, I believe, 3% of GDP. And therefore, being anticipatory, recognizing the different phases of the crisis, and is key. And I want to say that in our situation, leadership was centralized, and but all the experts from every segment in the private sector were brought in to give their views, and so every angle was heard. But most important is having clarity. Every policy, as a policy maker for 35 years, actually, you have to have clarity in what outcome you want to achieve. And then knowing, having in place the governance process, the decision-making process, the institutional arrangements for that, and then the accountability. So, and the approach has to be comprehensive rather than piecemeal. And this world, as you have described it, is highly interconnected. And although we are having some convergence, there are different parts, even within a country, you have this challenge of coordination. And this is key because you have to take a comprehensive approach. And the final point is that communications, everyone needs to know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what the progress is. And so even in this COVID current environment, all these elements are very key, and those who have done it, we can observe that they're doing better, and those who haven't, they haven't done as well. So I think I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Some really key, clear messages there. Katie, over to you.
Very much, Susan. A lot of what you've talked about, I mean, I definitely echo in terms of decision making and experiences, and certainly the interconnectedness of things. If I look at the global financial crisis, which for banking and insurance groups, it looms still very large, albeit it was now a kind of decade away. For me, I was sitting in Old Mutual at that time, and you know, Susan, you started off talking about the interconnectedness and the speed at which things happen and the need for global coordination. If I think of my own experience of the global financial crisis, it would have been products being written in Bermuda, on balance sheet in via sales forces in Hong Kong, on balance sheets in London, supported by assets out of South Africa. So the interconnectedness and global nature of it was absolutely significant in the speed of which you need to kind of react when things are happening. You know, following that crisis, I got the real tremendous opportunity and privilege to go to base myself out of South Africa for the 5 years. So there was repairing from the crisis. South Africa as a nation itself was actually relatively protected from the GFS just because of their own sort of system, albeit we were still a London-based company. But I think one of the things that I really learned there, and is a real important part of leadership today, is that out of all these crises, there's also, you have to find a way to kind of heal and repair what happens in the crisis. You know, and South Africa's obviously had its own existential issues over the number of decades in terms of the apartheid era. And what I entered there, I think, was some of my biggest kind of leadership lessons as we went through this post-apartheid world. And I think it's been really important today is that you must talk and debate what the crisis is doing, what it's doing to different sectors of society, how it feels to be walking in shoes. You know, many people, we read a lot about it in the press today, actually, the recent COVID crisis, they've had a good crisis. For others, it has been very different. But for us all to survive as a society, it's important that we really understand and debate the realities which we're living in the various sectors of the organisation, of society, and for the society that we serve. And I think as we entered this crisis, you know, certainly within the banking industry, there are many of us who, you know, we did the global financial crisis, we understand how to deal with the crisis, but this was very different. It was around health, and it had the potential to become a real economic crisis and then a banking crisis as a result, if governments and businesses didn't work really closely together. And I think from our own perspective, that lesson from South Africa about the importance of the whole truth and reconciliation and talking about what it feels like has really been a real guiding light for us as we went through. Within the NatWest group, we had just launched our new purpose at the time, you know, that we champion potential, helping people, families and businesses to thrive. And that was the real guiding light for our organisation as we've seen ourselves through this last 15 months. You know, talking to people, understanding what it meant, and really empowering our people to say, actually, how can we maximise the potential of this situation for good, whether it's for our own staff, for the families that we serve, or whether for the businesses that we work with. And I just think having that guiding light and a kind of guiding operational basis of really debating and talking and using sort of talk as the ability to kind of heal and move forward through these crises has been a really important part of my own kind of leadership lessons, both of the old and then what we've kind of brought into this new crisis, which we're still in the middle of. I think Dr. Zeti, we're all hoping for the V-shaped 6-month recovery. It doesn't feel necessarily as sharp as that at times, as we still feel in the midst of it, but we can definitely see through working together and debating that it does work. It works incredibly well, and I think incredibly powerfully for good. And Susan, I think we'll get into more aspects of what we think can be done as we move out of this into the reality of a post-COVID world as well.
Katie, thank you very much. And again, some really wise words drawing on your very interesting background and experience. So I'd like to explore some of these areas in a little more detail. You both have talked about, Dr. Zeti, about centralized leadership. And of course, this was from the central bank, which is a public institution, and yet listening to everyone else. And Katie, you've talked about sort of, again, governments and sort of what's distributed and what is central. And so I wonder if you could both, coming to the theme of financing sustainability, and that word sustainability, of course, is widely taken and used differently by different people, but could you just give us some thoughts about how much of this should be really led or driven by governments as opposed to private sector organizations? I mean, this is a kind of balancing tightrope act, if you will, that has been coming out of the COVID pandemic. Governments had to just jump in and take and exercise powers. Many of them hadn't been exercising for a long time, and yet we need to now move out. And how do you let go? How do governments let go, or should they? So if either of you, Kitty, maybe I'll start with you, and then Dr. Zeti follow up. What's that balance between government and private sector in financing sustainability?
I think it's an absolute, it's a marriage. You cannot do one without the other. They have to interconnect as we go through. And I think that what we've seen is why governments have been able to react well in many situations as the crisis was unfolding in terms of COVID, was that speed of decision making, the taking the views, as I think you did so well in Malaysia as well, of what business was saying, but then making a decision and kind of running with it. So what we need to do is, I think, Susan, you're right, is as we come out of the other side, we need to make sure that we keep the balance in the relationship really working well, so that we continue to have government play their role, as well as the public sector has a huge place to play the role. You know, a great example. You know, we all are talking a lot about how, as banks, we change our balance sheets and the carbon intensity of the balance sheet. We've made commitments to reduce it by 50%. Other banks have made all sorts of other commitments as well. But we can only do those if also government is putting the right rules and the right guidance. You know, I can say for as often as I like that we'll reduce the intensity of the impact of our mortgage book, for example, and the amount of carbon that involves. That requires governments to make decisions on things like water sourcing, what kind of gas and oil and solar and wind kind of bands we have of electricity. And so actually there is around government creating a framework and an architecture, which then public sector can work in together. So I do believe that the bond between government and private sector is stronger than ever. I really think that COVID has shown that actually it can work to such great advantage when it really works well. And actually together we've got the real ability to make the change that we can. So definitely interconnectedness, and greater, I think, than maybe it was pre-COVID, is something that I think we'll really see the path as we navigate our way through this.
Thanks very much. Dr. Zeti, other thoughts in this space?
Yes, well, both the public and private sector have a very important role in financing this sustainability. First of all, the public sector, with its speed that most have demonstrated already, provided relief. And this is key because of the damage that across the board that has occurred as a result of this COVID pandemic and the economic shutdowns and so on. So aside from relief, it is also keeping the economy afloat. And the private sector, in terms of the financial institutions, also have their role in not just pulling back during these times, but provide access to financing. Then the more important aspect is on the post-COVID, after following the recovery, or as we are experiencing the recovery and the containment of the COVID, is the investment for the future. And this is where financing becomes key. First of all, to have line of sight that we need to invest in the future. It is not just the stimulus for the current and the access to financing for the current to support businesses at this time. This is important just to stay afloat, but we need to invest for the future. And the future is actually going to be very different from the current future. And therefore, we also need to recognize this, the kind of infrastructure we need, the digitalization, the public sector needs to look at what kind of education system is needed in this new environment and so on. It is investing for the future if we are going to invest for the sustainability. And then, of course, there's for the environment as well. Those issues have been discussed. But for the private sector, they also need to recognize that the government is not going to be able to do it on its own. And therefore, for example, many countries in Asia have already had issued bonds where they are long-term, long gestation bonds for long gestation investment projects that are for infrastructure for 10, 20, 30 years. And the pension funds, insurance industry, and asset management corporations, investment corporations are all very interested actually in participating in these kind of investments. But they also want to be given assurance, of course, that these projects are well managed, there's a governance process, accountability, and that it's financially viable. So all these elements are key in encouraging the private sector to participate in these investments for the future.
Okay, thank you. Let me, I mean, you've made the point, and in a way both of you have, about anticipation, about looking ahead. And this gets to my concern about decisions that are near term, which are a whole lot easier than decisions that work for the long term. We have a question from one of our audience, Dr. Sarah Ivory, who says the climate crisis needed action long before many were convinced that it was a crisis. And of course, we're now racing to catch up. Could either or both of you reflect on how to mobilize action on crises before they're actually accepted as such a big risk, as a crisis? I mean, how do you do that anticipatory work and actually make it happen in organizations?
I mean, Susan, I think that's a great question, because I mean, you know, the organizations were run to a large extent by kind of 3-year plans. And if I look at something like the climate crisis, which we'll talk a huge amount more this year with COP26 coming more and more in anticipation, and also this, you know, weekend with G7 in play as well, that will be there. So, you know, many would say that crisis has been 40, 50 years in the making, and actually we're only just kind of waking up now that we need to start to do the change. I think there is a thing about forward looking, and you know, it's very easy to be critical of, say, oh well, we should have acted earlier. But where people are acting today, let's make sure that we really act today. And that's why I think that the partnership we've talked about with government is important. You know, the whole kind of longer term debt raising aspect is important. And sort of picking up on things that Dr. Zeti was saying, you know, I think what we've done a lot of in the bank is really kind of set targets for how we do some of our debt issuance, to make sure that it's really backing those kind of assets that actually make real difference, whether it be in social housing or whether it be in green investments and things like that, and trying to look much longer term to say, actually, this is the area that we know that we need to change. So we have things like targets around how much of our debt issuance is backing those ESG type factors. And I think that's something that's becoming much more mainstream and helps us to look to say, actually, how do we prevent that crisis, because we've got the fundamentals in place and we're working with businesses to be on a transition. And it's the forward debate of what could be the risks that are coming to face us as a society today. You know, we talk a lot about Bitcoin, and I won't kind of hurl ourselves into the kind of risks of digital currencies. I'm sure Dr. Zeti would have great views on that, but I think it is making sure that you're looking forward as well as acting for today, and that's one of the hardest balances for any organisation to get to. But I do think the long-term nature of funding and transition is something that we are all collectively paying much more focus on now, as we realise how long it takes to evolve a lot of that kind of climate change onto our balance sheet. It's a long and patient process that we're now part of.
Thank you very much. Dr. Zeti, what about this business of anticipation?
Yes. Any environmental scan needs to be very forward-looking. And of course, at central banks, we started actually doing stress tests well before it became fashionable to do it. We started doing this after the Asian crisis. And what is key to be anticipatory of what the risks of climate change that is in the making for us is to be able to understand what is the impact of these things that are being done now that is plundering the environment, that is damaging the environment, that is causing carbon emissions and so on. There needs to be an understanding of all these issues and how these things that are happening before us are going to be damaging the environment. And so this understanding has to be, there has to be research, and then it has to be disseminated and communicated so that there's an understanding of the importance of looking beyond our current circumstances, even beyond the medium term, but the longer term. And then what needs to be done in order to correct this and how it can be achieved. And of course, this has to be a collaboration between both the public and private sector. There's no way that we can rely on the private sector or the government to do it on their own. And so this is all about addressing that issue collaboratively.
Thank you very much. Let me stay on the theme of climate because as we've been hearing and we know, COP26 is coming soon and we're all very much focused. So climate, we used to talk about it in terms of greenhouse gases and CO2 and you know, emissions. That was our language, and that has evolved over time, and it's become more elaborate and more complex, and we're now talking about climate in terms of global temperature change, but also biodiversity and nature. And biodiversity has become flora diversity and fauna diversity, and you know, there's a proliferation as we come to grips with something. Alan Watt has asked an interesting question. Is the problem with sustainability that we don't have real transparency over the level of the crisis? COVID is blindingly obvious. We know what it is and what it does and how tragic and dreadful it is. But climate, it's harder to reflect, perhaps in risk assessments, perhaps in share prices. There will be a post-COVID world, but will there be a post-climate crisis world? So any thoughts about that?
Well, many central banks, if I may, many central banks have already recognized and shown in reports how climate shocks affect the macroeconomy, climate shocks affect the financial system, and climate shocks affect the economy. And these kind of information is very vital to demonstrate that if we don't address this issue, that is going to affect our growth potential, our potential to develop, and the sustainability of our growth and development. So it's very key to demonstrate how these climate shocks, risks of climate shocks, really damages the whole functioning of our economy and its potential for progress. Yes,
yeah. Katie, anything to add, or we're having a lot of questions come in? So
no, that's great. I'll add a little look. One of the things that that really excites me at the moment around this climate piece, and the thing I talk a lot to my finance team, is that we've got this amazing moment where actually, as a bank and as finance professionals, we can really work together to change the direction of what the impact of climate is on society, whether it's through the issuance we've done of green bonds, which is, you know, the Treasury guys working deep into the models to find the right assets to do the debt raising against, or actually what we're doing with part of the PRA's biennial stress testing, where the team, the macroeconomics and things were all released today by the PRA for us to be able to kind of work into over the next couple of weeks. And I think the next 5 weeks we'll be taking our balance sheet, we'll be rolling it forward 30 years under different climate scenarios to say, actually, what does it do? What does it mean for this asset versus that asset? What does it mean in terms of how you fund it? Now, the answers that come out will be wrong. We all know that. That's fine. Stress test answers are wrong by their very nature because the stress never works out the way that you wrote it neatly in your office when you were sitting in the Bank of England. But what it will do is just give us the ability to actually really positive conversations about actually how do you fund this line of business? How do you fund that? What transition plan should we work on? What can we as a bank afford to deal with in terms of capital, and how that might move forward? So I think, you know, while the teams internally will work incredibly hard over the next 6 weeks to get these scenarios out, actually it'll be one of the first really good bits of data that's done on actual balance sheets with actual clients, really taking it forward to say, if we look at this, what does it mean for our carbon piece? So therefore, what are the actual actions we need to take? And, you know, I'm finance, so we love targets and we love measurements, and we love how we can neatly package things up and give you sort of tons per carbon meter for kind of emissions. But this really will enable us to do that. So I think it's at a very exciting time to be able to say, how do we get to that post-climate world? I'm a huge believer that it will exist one way or another, and I'd like to make sure that we can all exist in a much better way than we maybe have done in the past. So I think we're actually entering a really exciting phase to get real data to work out how we do that transition piece as we go forward. As a result of the PRA guys' work, it will be hard work, but it will give us huge insights into what it could actually mean with real data being worked through, to kind of to get then proper actions coming out of. So exciting time, Susan, I think, on this side.
Thank you very much for that. And you said in passing, you know, scenarios are never right. As someone involved heavily with economic forecasting in my fiscal commission work, and Dr. Zeti, you'll know this from the central bank, forecasts are never right either. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be trying, and you shouldn't be doing them, and you shouldn't be learning. And I think that's the lesson that you're saying there. But you're talking about the means, you know, how to do things. So let me pull on a comment and a question from Wendy Pring, which is, what are the panel's views on practical tools for ensuring that there's suitable due diligence, impacts are measured appropriately to support what's happening in rural communities, that support what's happening with smaller businesses, to support what is happening in communities in general, and what about regenerative opportunities within small business? In other words, we're talking things global here, we're thinking big, we represent large organizations, but the world is made up of a lot that are not large. Simon mentioned the Scotland's 2020 climate group that I chaired for a number of years. Scotland's business community, for the most part, is made up of medium and smaller sized businesses. And the whole point of that operation was to pull these organizations together, to learn from each other, and to, you know, to do all sorts of things. But what can you do within financial institutions to make sure we're reaching out right across all parts of the economy?
Happy to kick off on that. Look, small businesses are the absolute mainstay of any country and any community that we live in today. And if I think of, you know, what you saw happen in COVID, whether it was in the UK where we had a kind of bounce back loan scheme, or some of the additional funding that we have put into kind of packages to support SMEs to have real kind of tangible actions. We have this lovely system of accelerator hubs where we get entrepreneurs together for very specific programs to help them kind of build their business. What's been really interesting, I think, with all of those schemes is as you kind of layer them on top of each other, you can really start to see their action. Within our accelerator hubs, we now have a number of hubs that they take climate-focused businesses to help climate-focused SMEs in terms of how they either, launch their product, or how they transition their product from being not as climate friendly to being more climate friendly than it could be, without necessarily taking away the ethos of their business. So I think it's very easy when you talk about how do you do fundraising and things like that, and how do we do our debt issuance, to think of that as the macro. But the reality is those when we do a lot of that debt issuance, the money that we raise from those debts are going into, often, if I look at our social bond that we did, it was going in very specifically to some of the most deprived areas of the UK to make sure that we could really build on their development within those areas and create jobs in that space. You know, similarly with the green bond, it was very much to make sure that we were building renewable energy within different communities. So actually, big business, its foundations are absolutely in community and in SMEs. And I think if you ever lose the link between that, I think then you find yourself in a quite a sticky situation, because that is what's building the economy from the bottom up. And I think the amount of funding and the reactions that went through COVID, and the amount of funds that we have that are very much there segregated to be invested by the SME lens, is something that's really critical for that development. So they're all, if you think of the kind of the rainbow, the big business might be the top of it, but actually it's built on the arc of the smaller and the community businesses, as we all kind of grow up through those lenses, and they all need to work together for it to be able to work across the piece. But I think it's a good question, because often we can lose community and SME when we talk about those big global transactions.
Katie, thank you. And Dr. Zeti, if Katie has talked about bottom up, let me ask you a question that relates to inside out, if you will. This comes from John Holland, who's saying or asking, does a financial firm need to have an integrated and holistic view of its whole or system, its organization, technology, financial, and have a clear and idea, and be able to be explicit about how these elements come together, and be able to communicate explicitly to internal but also external parties? His observation was often we see organizations focusing on a couple of factors, leadership or culture or something else. But how important is that holistic view and getting that word out?
Right. Before that, I just wanted to add to the previous question, the key to for small businesses, small and medium scale businesses in this kind of environment is the access to financing. That is the key. And one of the things that we found very useful is providing credit guarantee schemes. And this provides increased access to financing. And very often it really paid off, because these loans didn't, or these financing didn't go bad. It was just the access that they didn't have to continue their businesses. Now, coming to this integrated approach, I couldn't say that it's very, very important, because silos or piecemeal approach is highly dangerous, because then you're compartmentalized or segmented in your approach to things. And if you digitalize or do some transformation in the organization, which is partial, then it doesn't allow you. Everyone in the organization has to have an alignment to what is it the organization, the purpose, the sense of purpose, what the organization wants to achieve. And with that, you look at all the elements that are part of it that will generate the outcome that you want. And therefore, whether it's to digitalize or whether it's to change the working arrangements or change the communication and so on, all this, every aspect. And actually, we did this at the central bank. After the Asian financial crisis, we looked at how we wanted to transform, and we wanted the whole organization to be aligned to what we want, the outcomes we wanted to achieve. So everyone knew their role and their part in achieving those outcomes. And so this is, it needs to be integrated, and having integrated thinking skills is also another aspect that is key towards achieving this holistic outcome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. And just continuing that theme of integration, if you will, we've had a couple of questions, one from Idi Husseini, who asks, how can business organizations incorporate and finance ethical finance, incorporate that into their operational activities? In other words, make it mainstream. And we've had a question from Liz Grant, who is asking whether there's an opportunity to integrate the health goal into the banking and financial net zero systems and finance for nature strategies. In other words, our strategies that are good for the planet, how do we make sure that they're also good for people, and the other way around? So that these questions are all around the integration of these goals. And let me put my own small cast on it as well. In various organizations I'm involved with, which are taking particularly climate and sustainability and ESG issues very seriously. The important thing is, how do we make sure that those issues are not add-ons to the business case for a project or for something else? They're not a footnote, that they are part of the thinking and the discussion throughout. How do we integrate that? So Dr. Zeti, you've got a smile on your face, so I'll turn to you first.
Yes, for example, making ethical finance a part of it. Well, when you do the assessment of the viability of financial viability of a project, you should add the assessment of what it does to ESG, whether and the environment is very well known now, but the impact on society is less taken into account. And moreover, the other G is often not even mentioned, and G stands for governance. And this is very important in my view. If we look at organizations that have failed, and I don't want to mention them, but there are many major organizations fail because of lapses in governance, and the financial cost of it is even bigger than, let us say, the disasters, natural disasters, and so on. So everything, it has to be integrated into the assessment to look at what is the impact. And very often that's very forward-looking, not only to look at the financial viability, but the potential impact that it could have on the environment, on society, and whether in fact there's accountability and governance process are for the organization that is making the investment.
Okay, thank you. Katie.
Susan, I think if I could draw on a little bit of the personal experience of the journey we've gone on within NatWest Group. So we've done a huge amount of work in developing the purpose, which I talked about earlier, around championing potential, helping people, families and businesses to thrive. But when we were doing that work, we worked with an organisation called the Blueprint for Better Business. It's a charitable organisation, and actually any of you can Google it very, very easily. And what they do is they talk about sort of 5 principles that we should be bringing to our purpose kind of lens. You know, and it goes from the honest and fair with customers and suppliers. How do you be a good citizen? How does this decision work with a guardian for future generations and a responsible and responsive employer? And then at the very centre of it, how does this purpose deliver long-staying sustainable performance? Now, we've done great work with this organisation, and what we do for any proposal that's coming up, the first page of the proposal has got a grid which talks to these 5 areas. Now, I'm the finance one, so I quite like the grid in the middle that's got the numbers. But actually, I think what we've really seen as we go through is to say that actually the numbers are no longer just enough. You've got to actually say, what am I doing with customers? What am I doing for my employees? What am I doing in terms of my role in society and for future generations? And it's been such a great kind of blueprint for us to work with, to be able to really bring into a lot of the decisions that we make in the organisation. And something I think that's worked really, really well. You know, and when people first write the documents, you know, it's okay, it's a bit sort of pithy kind of high level statements, but as you use it and you get more and more into it, and you really hold yourself to a framework. So I would say for those, the individual that asks about how do small businesses do it, is actually to think of what is the purpose I'm doing? What do I understand about my company's impact on the ES and the G, and where am I? And you know, I do think that taking the ideas from others who have thought long and deep about this, and you know, Mr. Wiki via Blueprint for Better Business has done such great work in here. You know, use it, take it, adopt it, and kind of reflect upon it, so that we are forcing ourselves for each of the decisions we're making to think both long and short term in that space. So I think it is accessible, and there are a lot of resources out there that we can use to help to make companies make and give those thoughts as to how they make some of those transitions.
Yes, so in essence, then it is to integrate this into the decision-making process. And for larger corporations, it is to integrate it into their governance process. And then
which is
have a framework for accountability as well.
Yeah, no, which is what we did exactly, Dr. Zeti. We said, as you bring your decisions, I want the first page to talk about how this aligns with the blueprint for business. And actually, you know, and that just improves the conversation. And as we go through. So I think that is something that's been quite a really helpful journey for us. We continue to be on it. But I just think having that at your heart has really helped us.
And thank you. I think very, very helpful interchange there. And Katie, I'm heartened to hear you say you love numbers and that's your natural space, but actually what matters is the people and the systems and the plans and so forth all around that. I have on occasion spoken to large groups of accountants and made a statement that numbers are simply abstractions and they're not real, and we have to get back to what's real. I do that a little bit.
The output rather than the input, I think, often is the thing that you have to remember. It's others' actions that cause the numbers to evolve.
Yeah, I know that absolutely right, and it gets at companies. You talk about purpose. You've done that several times. Companies, particularly banks, are very focused on their purpose. What is our purpose, and stating it and renewing it and so forth, and educating their staff. But we need to be able to, in any organization, be accountable for having delivered on that purpose, not simply be mildly embarrassed if we don't. So again, purpose isn't something over to the side that sits on a plaque on the wall. It has to be at the center and the core of the decisions and the judgments. And therefore, I mentioned the word organizational culture in my opening comments. I'm sorry, my dog is barking. But the purpose needs to be in the minds of every single person in our organizations for some of this to work and to work properly. We have just a few minutes left. I have a huge number of really helpful and thought-provoking questions. But let me just ask you, and this is really a quick yes or no. We often see a CFO become a CEO in an organization. That's a typical career path.
Yep.
Do we expect to see a chief sustainability officer move to the CEO at a major institution anytime soon? Any thoughts?
So I mean, if I look in terms of what a CEO has to deliver now, a CEO who doesn't have sustainability at the absolute heart and soul of their strategy, I think they're going to struggle to kind of move forward. So I think it's perfectly possible in terms of that you can see that kind of progression, because it's such a core part of what the job is today. Because sustainability, whether it's climate sustainability, financial sustainability, people sustainability, those are the threads. You know, we hold these positions for the people that come after us. And I think the sustainability is such a core part of everything that we do.
Yes, indeed, it would surface the agenda.
Yes.
It would surface the agenda.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Again, a final question, and then I'll just wrap up very quickly. And so I need very quick answers as well. So cheer us up. What will be better in our large banks and large organizations, but actually in all of them, and in our asset management organizations after the COVID crisis and after a successful COP26? What will look and feel better? Just a few off the top of your head thoughts.
So I think I would almost go back to where I began. You know, if I think my biggest kind of leadership lesson is actually it's through kind of talk and debate and understanding what's happening and the impact of all the different levels of whether it's society or within the organization or external. I think for me that a lot of what's happened during this COVID time, and we haven't touched on so many different aspects of things that we've also gone through, whether it be the kind of Black Lives Matter debates that we've had, I think it's really shown that actually get issues out into the open, talk about them, develop them, and kind of take them forward, and then make real goals and commitments about how you're going to deliver on them, and be measured and held to account on that delivery. You know, I'm very positive for the next phase. I think that big corporates and banks have got a really important role to play, and I think that we've demonstrated that actually we've learned a lot in the last 10 years. And I think that listening, putting into commitments and being measured is the thing I think we should be excited about.
Thank you. Dr. Zeti.
Well, the financial sector during this COVID crisis, this pandemic, has really demonstrated in many parts of the world resilience. And I think it was a payoff from what we had achieved earlier in all the reforms and strengthening of the regulatory system, and putting in place so many of the elements that will generate this resilience. And I think we've learned many lessons now from this COVID crisis that will also prepare us to return to yet a different world, but with different functioning of the economy and different way of life after this COVID pandemic. But we will rise up to it again, and should demonstrate that we will adopt the technology that is before us, and the new way of working and so on, that I think people have this adaptability and flexibility to adjust and rise up to it. And that is what we have to look forward to.
Thank you very much. And both of those are very positive statements. I shall just close now, first by thanking you, Dr. Zeti, and thanking you, Katie, for, I think, a brilliant conversation. You've engaged so well with these themes and have so much to share. Some of the what I call keepers from a conversation that strike me. Crises are dynamic phenomena. We need to see where they're going, but we need to know that they're changing all the time, and we need to keep adapting. Yeah, the importance of the clarity of desired outcomes and having the governance in place. Dr. Zeti telling us about governance, and you're right, to achieve those outcomes. Communications, Katie, you've mentioned this repeatedly, how important that is. Interconnectivity and the speed of change and the speed that things move around the world. You also talked about revealing and repairing, that it's important not to paper over issues, the place of purpose, and that investment has to be for the future, not just a stimulus for today. And I realize I'm a minute over, but I will just close with a personal anecdote. I worked in higher education for the first part of my life, dealing with students, with academics, with projects, with communities, in a very real world. I then went into banking for reasons I won't go through now. And I sat at my desk in a world where people spoke in jargon that was like foreign language to me. And I thought, good goodness, what, they don't talk to people. They're not dealing with anything. They're dealing with things in their world. This is a while back. I got past that over time, and a lot of, although I wound up running a bank, I've worked extensively in the areas of economic development and now, of course, in ethics and ethical finance. But what has struck me now more than ever before is the incredibly powerful role that financial institutions can play and are starting to play in terms of ensuring we have a sustainable and a healthy world going forward. We can influence through what we do internally, how we work with our own colleagues and our staff, but also how we guide all of our customers and our communities, and indeed government colleagues, to what is possible going forward. So financial institutions, this is in your hands. Thank you all very much, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.